Like I said, I wanted to talk about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And I thought that by reading this story in its entirety, all four Gospels put together, that would save us a little time in the sermon as well. That's our story. That's our text this morning. I want to draw a few points from that I think are, well, I call them just various points, but I think they're powerful points that we need to remember, and points that I think we need to know if we don't know of it. And that is that the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is what I call the event of all events. Sometimes I just stop in the middle of the day and think about all the stuff I've got going on in my life or what I want to accomplish. And I have to stop and think that it means nothing. I can accomplish a ton of stuff in the day, and it has no meaning, it has no purpose, it accomplishes nothing if it wasn't for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It's three events, but it's one event. And I think it's so important that we be reminded of that. I know you already know that. But sometimes we get so caught up in daily life, we forget that what gives life any type of meaning and hope and purpose is this event. And how people live without that knowledge and without accepting this event, I don't know how that happens. I don't know how they do that. Life, as Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, is just an endless cycle. It goes over and over and over until it does come to an end. And at some point, we might wake up and just say, why are we doing all this? What is this all about? And that's where God comes in the picture. God gives meaning to it, and guidance, and focus. And so I want to talk about the event of all events. It is the most crucial event in the history of mankind, bar none. Bar none. It is a historical event that is real, that has changed more lives than any other historical event. And because God was in control of all of it. And so the first thing that I would like to say, the thing that stands out to me, is that we might think about the death of Jesus as Jesus just dying on a cross. He's just paying the sacrifice. That his time to teach and to change hearts is over. That was that 3+ years that he went about teaching people all over in their towns and villages. But what stands out to me is this remarkable evidence that even on the cross, Jesus has very few words. It's not about teaching people from the cross, but just dying on that cross, hanging on the cross. Jesus changes hearts. People are changed. And I think you're going to see a pattern that the people around the cross know something about Jesus. They know what he taught. They know what he claimed. But up to this point, it has no impact on them. But there's something about being there present as Jesus dies on the cross. Probably the changed heart that you first think of is that criminal on the cross. Some call him the thief on the cross, right? Sometimes it takes a little while for the heart to change, and that appears to be what happens with this criminal on the cross. Some critics believe that what we have here is a contradiction between the Gospels. Because the other Gospel writers have, as we read in the combined story, they have both criminals hurling abuse at Jesus. But Luke shows at some point this criminal, and I believe this is the answer, that this is not a contradiction, but this criminal has a change of heart. There are lots of times when people become very, very real when they're on their deathbed. They have a very clear picture of their life and the situation they're in. It's a lot of people have a change of heart when they're facing death. And I believe that's what's happening to this criminal. And so look, if you would, at Luke chapter 23. And let's just read these words again. As at some point they were hurling abuse, both of them, but this, as he hangs on the cross, this thief, this criminal, has a change of heart. In Luke 23, beginning verse 39, and one of the criminals who were hanged there were hurling abuse at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other answered, and rebuking him said, "Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." And he was saying, "Jesus, remember me when you come in your kingdom." And some of the most cherished words of all the Bible, he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise." And so, we need to relate to this criminal on the cross. We need to put ourselves into his shoes, because there's a great parallel. And you say, yeah, I want those same words. I will be with Jesus in paradise. Yes, but it goes beyond that. I want you to notice, as he is facing death, this change of heart, he recognizes that he's on that cross because of what he did, what he deserves. He says to his fellow criminal, we're getting what we deserve. We did bad things. We did illegal things. We did sinful things. But he must have had some knowledge of Jesus before this, but it had no bearing on his life until this point. And now he says to Jesus, "You're innocent. I know you're innocent. Please remember me." I like to ask this question of Christians. Do we want justice when sin is committed, or do we want mercy? And we need to be careful how we answer that, because, we're like, well, we don't like it when things go wrong, when people do bad things, and we want justice. Well, what about when we sin? Oh, well, then we want mercy. God sent His Son to the cross not that we might experience justice, not what we deserve, but that we could get mercy. And we need to remember that. We need to, though we're not talking about it, we need to remember Barabbas, who possibly was supposed to be the third criminal on these crosses. And if Jesus had not shown up that day, he might have been that third criminal. He might have been there in the middle. But what happened? Jesus showed up, and what? He took his place. That's us. We relate to what? The criminal on the cross. We relate to the criminal Barabbas, because what? We get what we deserve, but not Because Jesus showed up. Because Jesus showed up, we get mercy, not justice. Not what we deserve. And so something about hanging on the cross. This man had a change of heart. There's another person that was on the scene of the cross that had a change of heart. And that was the centurion. Now again, it took some time. It wasn't till the very end that he has this change of heart, but it appears, as we read in our story, the combined story, it told us the soldiers were mocking him with sour wine, telling him to save himself. And I would imagine the centurion was right along with that. But I want to read that combined story. I'm going to combine Matthew 27, verse 54, and Luke 23, verse 47. And what do we have? As he sees Jesus dying on the cross, this is what happens. Now the centurion, and notice it's not just him, and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, the soldiers as well, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Notice that pronouncement. But then Luke tells us that the centurion what? Began praising God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." He must have known something about Jesus. At the beginning, it was like any ordinary crucifixion. It was an ordinary day. But when all this stuff happened at the end, he had a change of heart. And saw Jesus like the criminal on the cross, to innocent. That's one of the things about the cross as well. It was a normal thing to crucify the criminals, the rebels of Rome. But this was no ordinary crucifixion, because the Son of God was on the cross. And it was miraculous. You've got the Son being obscured, and experts always are trying to find some natural explanation of the date and time that could have happened. It was a miracle. You have the earthquake that happens right as Jesus takes his last breath. You've got the veil of the temple that is torn in two, not by any man. A man would have taken from the bottom to the top. It's from the top to the bottom that it's rent, that it's torn apart. And then not on this event, but in the culminating event of the resurrection, Jesus is not the only one resurrected. You heard that part of the story? Others were resurrected as well. Jesus was the first to be resurrected. But he wasn't the only one. There were all sorts of miracles that surrounded the death of Jesus, and it was part of what made this a changing life experience for people. But it wasn't just the criminal on the cross. It wasn't just the centurion. The onlookers. In Luke 23, verse 38, and all the multitudes who had come together for the spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began return beating their breasts. In my studies, that I've learned that's akin to in the Old Testament, where they used to tear their garments when they were shocked or upset or something troubling, very troubling happened. They rend their garments. I don't know if these onlookers were looking and just saying, "Hey, let's see what happens to this Jesus." I like the word Luke uses, spectacle. But in the end, they had a change of heart. I don't know if it was a believing change of heart, but they were disturbed. They knew this was not normal. Perhaps they were disturbed because an innocent man they had put on the cross and killed. And so that's one of the amazing things to me, is that even just dying on the cross, Jesus is changing hearts. Isn't that amazing? And if you haven't let Jesus and His death on the cross change your heart, if you haven't confessed that He was innocent and you are guilty, and you haven't come to really understand and accept the death, burial, and resurrection into your life, we hope that you will. And we want to help you do that. But Jesus' death on the cross changed hearts without words being said. I think another thing that's interesting about the death of Jesus is that it's an event that no one expected. Not even the disciples or the apostles were expecting this event. Now, keep in mind that you have all of these messianic prophecies, but they missed it. Keep in mind that Jesus, over and over, prior to the cross, told them multiple times in great detail, I'm going to be handed over to the Gentiles. And they're going to crucify me, but on the third day I'm going to be raised again. And it wasn't that the Jewish people were not attuned to messianic prophecy and trying to figure out the pieces of the puzzle. Look, if you would, at John 7:41 and 42. In John 7:41, others were saying, this is the Christ. Still others were saying, surely the Christ is not going to come from Galilee, is He? There's this debate. And they bring up this fact that Jesus is from Galilee. And they say, well, the Messiah doesn't come from Galilee. And here, look, has not the Scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David? And from Bethlehem, the village where David was? You see, they made those connections. The Messiah comes from the lineage of David, and He's born, He comes from Bethlehem. They got it right, but they got it wrong. They got it right in that they understood Malachi chapter 2, He's going to come from Bethlehem. They got it wrong, they didn't do their homework. They didn't realize that Jesus was from Bethlehem. He was born there. So it wasn't that they weren't attuned to looking for messianic prophecies and relating them to the Christ. But they just didn't get it. It's not the Messiah that they were taught. It's not the Messiah that they were expecting. It just didn't register. And I can understand that. As a volunteer firefighter, a couple Saturdays ago, it was my turn to help with checkout. And what checkout is where we take all the stuff on the truck and we make sure it's there, make sure it's working, so that if we get a call, we don't have time to check it all out. We need to know it's there and it's working, so we can just go. Well, because of this COVID-19 pandemic, we have some new PPE. So whatever medical gear, medical call we go on, we've got to be fully geared up, even if it's not COVID-19. Well, like I said, it's new equipment. And I went to the medical compartment to check out the medical equipment, and it wasn't there, and it didn't even register to me because it wasn't normal equipment. It wasn't what we usually have there. And someone had taken it out. Someone had removed it, and it did not register. I did not figure that out. And so I okayed the medical box, and wouldn't you know it, that morning we got a call. We run to the call, and the PPE is not there. And we can't go inside. This was not a COVID-19 situation, but we could not render aid to that person because I made a mistake. It just didn't register. Boy, you can believe I'm checking it all the time now. But that's the way it was with the disciples and the apostles. Even though Jesus told them, I'm going to be raised on the third, it just didn't register. It's not the normal. It's not an event they expected. But this is one of the interesting things I think as well. The death, burial, and resurrection is the event of all events. You would think that there's all these messianic prophecies about this event. Well, when it comes to the death of Jesus, there are. Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, Psalm 22, and a host of others that point to the Messiah dying, even on a cross. Probably Isaiah 53, Psalm 22 are the biggest ones that we know of. But what about the resurrection? I mean, the death of Jesus is an important part of this event, but without the resurrection, the death of Jesus means nothing. I mean, the opponents had no problem with the death of Jesus. What they were worried about is the resurrection of Jesus. They didn't believe in that. It is a crucial event. In fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then there's no resurrection of Christ, and Christianity has no meaning. It's vanity of vanities. The resurrection of the Messiah is so crucial. So you would think, like the death of Jesus, you would think that there is just one messianic prophecy after another messianic prophecy after another messianic prophecy so that the resurrection of Jesus would be just clear. And the answer to that is no. This is one of the amazing things to me. How many messianic prophecies are there about the resurrection of the Christ? There's one. And it's not the clearest prophecy. In fact, the whole resurrection is one verse, one sentence. When the apostles went out and preached the gospel, they were going to preach to people that, especially Jews, that were going to say, okay, you tell us the Christ was supposed to die and be resurrected. Where's that in the Old Testament? And here's the passage they use. Psalm 16, 8 through 10. Verse 10 is the passage. For thou wilt not abandon my soul to Sheol, neither wilt thou allow thy Holy One to undergo decay. That passage right there, when you look at it from this side of the cross, it makes perfect sense. The Messiah is going to die, but He's not going to stay dead. He's going to die, but He's not going to stay dead long enough to where His body decays. It's going to come back to life. They didn't get that. They didn't look at this as messianic. And I don't know if I could blame them. What they did is they translated this, that David was talking about himself. So let's just look at the first time that Peter uses this in Acts chapter 2. Let's go to Acts chapter 2. And in verse 22, the day of Pentecost. Group of Jews there for Pentecost. Peter is preaching. And what's he trying to convince them of? He's not trying to convince them that there's one God, Yahweh. They already know that. He's not trying to convince them that Jesus was a real person. They know that. They know they killed Him. What he's trying to convince them is that the Scriptures say the Messiah not only dies, but is raised. Verse 22. Peter preaches, Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles, wonders, and signs which God performed through Him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. God knew you were going to do this. It was all part of His plan. You nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put Him to death. But God raised Him up again, put an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for Him to be held in its power. And so there's the claim. God raised Jesus, and now they're going to say, well, prove that with Messianic prophecy. Prove that with Old Testament scriptures. And he pulls out Psalm 16, 8 through 11. Verse 25, David says of him, I saw the Lord always in my presence, for He is my right hand, so that I will not be shaken. And therefore my heart was glad, my tongue exulted. Moreover, my flesh also will live in hope. The Messiah dies, but He's still here. So I exult. And why? Verse 27, because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay. You have made known to me the ways of life, and you will make me full of gladness with your presence. There's that Psalm 16, verse 10. You'll not allow me to undergo decay. So look at verse 29. Brethren, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us today. He says it's not David. You were told it's David. You can go, and his tomb is in Jerusalem, and you can see that tomb and see David's still dead. But when you go to the tomb of Jesus, it's what? It's empty. It's open. Jesus isn't there anymore. And so he explains verse 30, and so because David was a prophet and knew God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on his throne, he looked ahead and he spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. We saw Him raised up. Isn't that amazing? Such a crucial event that gives definition, that gives foundation, that gives purpose and meaning to all of Christianity, and is all based on one messianic prophecy that tells us it was going to happen. But sometimes that's the test that God has of faith. How many passages do you need? The faithful? Just one. The Jews missed it. But they were given a second chance through the preaching of the gospel, and many didn't miss it the second time. We pray that you won't miss it. This was God's plan all along. Even though no one expected it. One of the amazing things is that their view of the Messiah was going to be this conquering ruler, this conquering king. They lived in the days of the Romans, and the Romans had that view of their rulers and their kings and their generals. In fact, they had this great Roman processional of victory, in which they'd go out to battle, they'd come victoriously, and they had this victory parade in essence. Because they didn't get defeated, because they didn't die. But Paul, in a couple of his writings, uses the same image of the Roman victory procession. But the victor is Jesus. And the victory comes through death, burial, and resurrection. That's not the way it works in the world. But that's the way it works for God. And finally, let me make one more point as we close. There is power in the resurrection. There is power to change hearts and to change lives. But you have to let the resurrection have that power over you. How important is the resurrection? Well, as we've said, it is the event of all events. It is the culminating event of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. It is the culminating thing that brings the victory over Satan and sin and death. Death, where is your sting? It's gone because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's nothing more important than the event of all events. But in order for it to have power, you have to understand the resurrection. You have to believe truly in it. How important is it? All of Christianity is based on an empty tomb. I want you to get the significance of that. There is not a single religion whose whole hope and foundation and meaning is on an empty tomb. That's why we're all here. That's why we make the sacrifices we do, because of an empty tomb. But it's not the tomb that is significant. It's significant because who was, not is, but who was in that tomb. Because God was in that tomb. Think about all the religions, Islam, Buddha, Hindu. They're not based on an empty tomb. Christianity lives and dies on the empty tomb. But here's the question. What does it mean to believe in the resurrection? I know we all believe in the resurrection, but do we really understand what a belief in the resurrection and its power is all about? I would imagine a lot of us would say, well, yes, I believe in the resurrection. I know it's got power, that one day I will die, but I won't stay dead. One day I will be resurrected to eternal life, and that's the power of the resurrection. And that absolutely is true. But if we only think that the resurrection has power in the future, we don't understand what it means to believe in the resurrection. What does it mean to believe in the resurrection? Well, I see a lot of people give up on marriage. Maybe they married short time, maybe sometimes 20, 30 years, then they give up on it. And you talk to them and they say, well, our marriage is what? It's dead. Well, why are you giving? Well, I said it's dead. I'm giving up on it. It's dead. Well, you don't believe in the power of the resurrection. Well, what are you talking about? Well, here's the point. If God can take a dead body, it's impossible to bring him back to life. We can't do that. But if God can take someone that's truly dead and bring them back to life, surely He can do that with a dead marriage. Amen? Now, you might have to do some difficult things. You may have to find a lot of humility. But God can work through all that and resurrect that marriage. You've got a dead relationship with someone, a brother, a sister, a mother, a father, whoever it might be. It might be dead because you maybe just, I don't really care that much about it. But we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. And maybe we need to think a little bit harder about that relationship. that dead relationship, if you believe in the power of the resurrection, you know that God can resurrect that. And we already know that God can heal the sick. The people knew in Jesus' day He can heal the living. But His whole purpose of resurrecting John 11, Lazarus, was to show He's got the power not only over the living, but over the dead. And so, don't look at the power of the resurrection and have your faith only looking to the future. Believe in the power of the resurrection in everyday life. Give into that. Let it change your life so that you can live a life knowing that Jesus Christ is risen. The event of all events. So you can know and say, death, where is your sting? That concludes our lesson this morning.